Hey there. I want to spend some time today talking about society in Russia, and I'm also going to roll in the segment from your textbook in the current events section about demography and the declining population. Let's start, as we generally do, with social cleavages. The sources of social cleavage should be, broadly speaking, familiar to you by now, but I'll focus on a couple of major ones in Russia. Number one is ethnicity. Russia is relatively homogenous among our case study countries. About 80% of the population is ethnically Russian, but there's also a wide variety of other ethnic groups, which, as you know, have in many places certain accommodations, a greater degree of autonomy under Russia's system of so called asymmetric federalism, although, as you also should know, Putin has been cracking down on that lately. The other major source of social cleavage is religion. It's really tricky to get religious identification nailed down in Russia in terms of percentages and distribution across the population with any real consistency. Part of that is because religious identity is just inherently kind of a finicky thing. Part of that is also because there was this legacy in the early Soviet period of actively repressing religious activities. And so some people will continue to have some level of private religious belief without publicly identifying with a particular religious identity. So, to give you a sense of that kind of that the range of estimates of religious identification, your textbook has a chart saying that 20% of Russians are Orthodox Christians, whereas a survey by the Pew Foundation in 2017 says that 71% of respondents describe themselves as Orthodox Christian, but only 7% of those of Russians go to church every week. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, and actually even in the later Soviet period, there's been growing tolerance for religious activity, and today Russia has an official policy of religious equality and religious freedom. Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodox Christianity, is historically, going back to the pre-Soviet period, the dominant faith in Russia. And there's a growing role today for the Russian Orthodox Church for political reasons that I'll talk about in a little while. One region that we often think about when we're thinking about the impact of social cleavages in Russian politics is Chechnya. Chechnya is a sub-national unit of government shaded in red on this map. It's a republic, which means that in theory it's supposed to have at least a little bit more autonomy. Chechnya is part of a broader geographic region called the Caucasus, which is basically the strip of land between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. That includes parts of Russia and also the countries of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Chechnya is a predominantly ethnically Chechen and religiously Muslim region. Muslims in Russia are concentrated in a few different regions, but one of them is the Caucasus. In 1991, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, Chechnya declared independence, and essentially the posture of the Soviet and then the Russian government was, we don't really have time to deal with this right now. And so up until 1994, Chechnya was operating de facto in practice as an independent state, but the Russian government never recognized Chechen independence in the way that it did with a number of other former Soviet socialist republics. In 1994, the Yeltsin government eventually decides we have ignored the situation for too long, and so they send troops into Chechnya. Russia fights a war for nearly 2 years with the Chechen separatists that, despite the massive imbalance in military forces and in sophistication of military technology in favor of Russia, despite those factors, the Russians fail, and in 1996, they reach a peace agreement which effectively leaves Chechnya more or less to govern itself, although again, not actually achieving the status of a fully independent sovereign state. Then fast forward to 1999. So the situation persists for a couple of years. And under this de facto autonomy, Chechnya has been a major destination for militants who are attracted to a variety of different, really radical Islamist terrorist groups. And so Chechnya has been kind of a staging ground for a number of terrorist operations. In 1999, some militants attacked Dagestan, which is a neighboring region of Russia. And this is a significant crisis for the Russian government, in response to which, among other things, Boris Yeltsin is going to shake up his government and name as prime minister a relative political nobody by the name of Vladimir Putin. A month after that invasion of Dagestan, there's a series of bombings in apartment buildings in Moscow, which cause hundreds of deaths, massive, massive catastrophe for the country, the government will blame Chechen militants for this. But there's actually some reason, which I will post a link to in the comments, to suspect that that's not the full story. And there's actually some pretty significant evidence that this might well have been an activity by these bombs might well have been planted by the FSB, by the Russian Security Service. Nonetheless, using the combined causes of the invasion of Dagestan and the bombings in Moscow, the Yeltsin government is going to launch a second war in Chechnya, and this time it's going to work. And by the way, this is also going to be an important factor in bringing Vladimir Putin to public prominence. So this war, Russia wins. The fighting is really brutal. There are a tremendous number of violations of human rights in the process. And separatists are going to turn to terrorism outside of Chechnya since they no longer have real territorial control in Chechnya. Most notably, most horrifically, in 2004, some radical Chechen separatists will take an entire elementary school hostage in the city of Beslan. And in the subsequent fighting, 350 of those hostages, most of whom are children, will be killed. By 2010, the Russian government has mostly succeeded in defeating Chechen separatists and reestablishing control. Chechnya today is controlled by a pro-Moscow government. It's led by Chechens. These are not people who are necessarily directly appointed and sent in from Moscow. The current leader of Chechnya is a guy named Ramzan Kadyrov, who's a fairly brutal, fairly authoritarian leader, but also a pretty loyal client of Vladimir Putin's. And so the bargain that the Chechen separatists have struck is now essentially we're going to tolerate some degree of submission to Moscow. We're going to recognize that Chechnya is a part of Russia in exchange for this relative autonomy and also pretty significant patronage from Vladimir Putin and his political allies. Moving on to some more general statements about ideology and political culture in Russia. So when you survey Russian citizens, they tend to express somewhat limited interest in politics. That might make sense in the context of Russia's relatively limited history of allowing citizens to participate directly in electoral democracy. The government, under Putin in particular, has tried to kind of create a political culture from the top down, centered around the values of nationalism, of protecting tradition in particular, through Putin and other elites' very public statements of support for the Russian Orthodox Church, and more generally, this idea of restoring Russia's former greatness as a world power. And so you'll see a lot of rhetoric by Putin and his allies and his political party promoting things like the idea that Russia needs to stand up against the West, against imperialist bullying, that the Orthodox Church and these sort of long-standing, thousand-year-old Russian traditions are really the key to Russian greatness, and it's the government's job to protect them. The invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in this course, is an important example of that kind of rhetorical positioning of Putin as the defender of Russian nationalism and Russian greatness and Russian power in the world. So that culture really suffuses Russian political conversation, but it's also kind of hard to tell the degree to which ordinary Russian people buy into that because, as you now know, the media is not particularly free and is largely dominated by government narratives. One last thing to note about Russia is that they just kind of generally have very limited trust in institutions. There's an organization called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveys regularly the public in 26 different countries about their levels of trust in various institutions. That includes businesses, the government, the media. Russia regularly ranks at or near the bottom of that list in terms of how much citizens trust their institutions. And so if you're thinking, for instance, about media censorship or media propaganda in Russia, it's just worth interpreting that with this understanding that a lot of Russians, thanks to the legacy of the combination of the late Soviet period and their memories of more recent post-Soviet governance, a lot of Russians have some degree of cynicism and skepticism about the messages that they receive, particularly through broadcast media. And so they're not necessarily just accepting all government propaganda uncritically. A lot of people will take it with a grain of salt. Last thing, and I am shifting here to the current issues section of your textbook, is just a couple of things worth noting about Russia's demography. You have seen a number, I think, of population pyramids. If you're taking my class, every time we talk about society, I like to show you these things. Russia's is the most weirdly shaped one in the course. First thing to note is that overall, for a country of its level of economic development, Russia's life expectancy is kind of surprisingly low. And there's a significant, as you can see from this population pyramid, there's a significant gender imbalance. So, on the life expectancy for women is an average of 75 years. For men, it's an average of only 64 years. Usually, when you see low life expectancy numbers like that, one major contribution is high levels of infant mortality. You tend to see that in economically developing countries. But in Russia, that's actually not the case. What's really bringing down the life expectancy is high levels of mortality for adults, and particularly for men. A couple of explanations for this. One possibility is that the healthcare system has deteriorated and just isn't that good at providing care to sick adults. Another, among men especially, is that Russia has really high levels of alcohol consumption, and that's going to help explain its really high rates of death by circulatory diseases, which are associated with alcoholism, and also by accidents and suicides and homicides, all of which can be exacerbated by high levels of alcohol consumption. So this is a major concern for Russia in terms of public health. Russia also has low fertility rates. I think in 2017, 2018, maybe the birth rate was something like 1.58 children per woman. So this is below what we call replacement rate, which is the level necessary to keep the population at the same number, absent any kind of immigration into the country. And so the net result of all of these factors is that Russia's population is expected to shrink in the coming decades. There's one projection that says that the population at current rates will decline by 20 million people by 2050. And that's a significant concern for political leaders in Russia, especially if you're trying to think about projecting economic and political power around the world. And it's a really tricky problem for any government to solve. I will leave it there on that less than cheery note. Thank you.